We all experience moments where we stand at the edge of an opportunity, looking out at the unknown, filled with trepidation. Our hearts race. Our minds start conjuring up the worst-case scenarios. It's in these moments that we face a choice: do we take the leap, or do we retreat into safety? Today, I want to explore why so many of us choose the latter. Specifically, we'll look at 5 signs that you're afraid to take risks, drawing deeply from the psychological wisdom of Jordan Peterson. More importantly, we'll explore how this fear might be silently sabotaging your potential. Imagine standing on a metaphorical tightrope, suspended high above the ground. Each step forward is a risk. It's a balancing act between fear and courage. Yet the tightrope walker understands an essential truth: the only way to master the walk is to keep moving forward, no matter how terrifying. But many of us don't take that step. We freeze. Why? Because we're afraid of what might happen if we move forward. Jordan Peterson often speaks about fear in the context of life's challenges and how we can either confront it or let it dominate us. One of the most profound ideas he presents is that fear is inevitable, but what matters is how we respond to it. Fear isn't just an emotion, it's a psychological force that shapes our reality. If we choose to avoid what scares us, our world shrinks and we become smaller. But if we confront our fears, our world expands. The first sign that you're afraid to take risks is hesitation. You've been there, right? An opportunity arises, and instead of seizing it, you find yourself overthinking. You're caught in a loop of indecision. Peterson explains this as a form of self-protection. When we hesitate, it's because we're avoiding the unknown. We're avoiding the chaos of uncertainty. Peterson often speaks of chaos and order as 2 fundamental components of life. Order represents safety, predictability, and structure. Chaos, on the other hand, represents the unknown, the territory where we feel unprepared and vulnerable. Click subscribe to this channel to get more insights into human psychology. Hesitation is a signal that we're clinging to order, unwilling to step into chaos. But here's the paradox: all growth happens in chaos. You cannot expand your life, your potential, or your understanding of the world by staying within the realm of what you already know. Peterson emphasizes this in his discussions of the hero's journey, a narrative structure found in many myths, where the hero must leave the familiar world and venture into the unknown to find something valuable. The hero faces dangers, confronts their fears, and ultimately returns transformed. But that transformation only occurs because the hero took the risk of leaving the known world. When you hesitate, what you're really doing is avoiding the journey. You're staying in your comfort zone, even though deep down you know that everything you want lies outside of it. The second sign is rationalization. This is when you convince yourself that avoiding a risk is the smart thing to do. You tell yourself things like, "I'm not ready yet," or "it's not the right time." Rationalization is a defense mechanism. Peterson often talks about how our minds are incredibly adept at creating narratives that protect us from uncomfortable truths. In this case, the truth is that you're afraid. But instead of confronting that fear head-on, you create a rational story that justifies your inaction. Peterson's work often draws on the idea of confronting uncomfortable realities, what he calls bearing the burden of existence. To live fully is to face the harsh truths of life, including the fact that risk is unavoidable. There is no such thing as a life without danger or loss. Rationalization, then, is a way to avoid this truth. It allows you to stay in the illusion of safety. But as Peterson points out, safety is an illusion. The world is chaotic, and trying to avoid risk is, in itself, a risk. By not acting, You are allowing your fears to dictate your life. You are choosing safety over growth, and in the long run, that's a much more dangerous path. Think about it. How many times have you rationalized not going after something you truly wanted? How many times have you told yourself, later, or I'm not good enough yet? These are just stories you tell yourself to avoid facing the fear of failure, rejection, or uncertainty. But here's a hard truth from Peterson's perspective: if you wait until you're ready, you'll never act. There will always be a reason to wait. There will always be a reason to avoid stepping into the unknown. The third sign is procrastination. Procrastination is more than just putting things off. It's an active avoidance of what makes us uncomfortable. Peterson talks about the tendency to avoid difficult tasks as a form of self-deception. You tell yourself that you'll do it later, but what you're really doing is avoiding the immediate discomfort of starting. Procrastination, in Peterson's view, is a failure to confront the challenges of life. It's a way of pretending that you can delay what is inevitable, but life doesn't wait. In his lectures on responsibility, Peterson often emphasizes the importance of confronting the tasks that are in front of us, no matter how uncomfortable they might be. He argues that procrastination is a form of irresponsibility, a refusal to take on the burden of existence. And here's the problem: the longer you procrastinate, the larger the task seems. It grows in your mind until it becomes this insurmountable obstacle. Peterson likens this to the dragon in mythology. The longer you avoid confronting the dragon, the more powerful it becomes. But the moment you face it, you realize that it's not as terrifying as you imagined. Procrastination is a way of feeding the dragon. Every time you delay action, you reinforce the neural pathways in your brain associated with avoidance. It becomes easier and easier to put things off because your brain has learned that avoidance provides temporary relief. But as Peterson points out, this relief is short-lived. Eventually, the task catches up with you, and you're forced to confront it under far more stressful conditions. I want you to think about a time when you procrastinated on something important. How did it make you feel? And more importantly, what were you avoiding by putting it off? Was it the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough? These are the deeper psychological forces at play when we procrastinate. It's not just about being lazy, it's about avoiding the emotional discomfort that comes with risk. Let's continue where we left off. We've already touched on hesitation, rationalization, and procrastination, 3 signs that fear is preventing you from taking the risks that could transform your life. Now, let's dive deeper into the psychological mechanisms at play and explore the 4th sign: over-preparation. Over-preparation is a particularly deceptive form of avoidance. On the surface, it looks like you're doing the work. You're gathering information, honing your skills, planning every detail. But what's really happening is that you're using preparation as a shield against action. You tell yourself, I need to learn more, or I'm not ready yet, when, in reality, you're stalling because you're afraid of stepping into the unknown. Jordan Peterson often talks about the importance of competence and preparation, but he's also clear that there's a tipping point where preparation becomes an excuse. In his lectures, he discusses the concept of conscientiousness, one of the big 5 personality traits that refers to an individual's tendency to be diligent, organized, and responsible. While conscientiousness is generally a positive trait, Peterson warns that it can become maladaptive when it leads to excessive caution and perfectionism. Perfectionism, in particular, is a form of fear. It's the fear of being judged, the fear of failure, and, at its core, the fear of vulnerability. By over-preparing, you're trying to control every variable, to eliminate any chance of failure. But here's the paradox: no amount of preparation can completely eliminate risk. Life is inherently unpredictable. As Peterson often emphasizes, the world is full of chaos, and you cannot control chaos by preparing indefinitely. At some point, you have to act. The preparation, then, is a way to avoid confronting the reality that no matter how much you prepare, you're still going to be vulnerable. You're still going to be ill. You're still going to face uncertainty. And this is where Peterson's idea of courage comes in. Courage, he says, is not the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act in spite of it. In fact, if you're not afraid, it's not really courage. The hero's journey that Peterson so often refers to is not about eliminating fear, it's about facing it head-on. The hero steps into chaos not because they are unafraid, but because they know that growth only comes from confronting the unknown. Think about your own life. How many times have you told yourself that you're still getting ready for something? How many times have you delayed taking action because you convinced yourself that you weren't prepared enough? This is a form of self-deception. You're not preparing because you're being diligent, you're preparing because you're afraid. You're trying to shield yourself from the discomfort of vulnerability. Peterson often speaks about the importance of exposure, the idea that the only way to overcome fear is to face it in manageable doses. This concept is rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), particularly in the treatment of anxiety disorders. Peterson explains that when you expose yourself to the thing you fear in small, controlled amounts, you slowly build up your tolerance for discomfort. Over time, what once seemed terrifying becomes manageable. This is how you expand your competence and your courage. But exposure requires action. You cannot simply prepare indefinitely, hoping that one day the fear will vanish. You have to take the first step, even if you feel unprepared. This is why over-preparation is so dangerous. It keeps you stuck in a loop of inaction. It gives you the illusion of progress, but in reality, you're avoiding the very thing that would lead to real growth. Now, let's move to the fifth and final sign: self-sabotage. This is perhaps the most insidious form of fear because it often operates unconsciously. Self-sabotage occurs when you sabotage your own success, either by making poor decisions, procrastinating, or setting yourself up for failure. It's the ultimate form of avoidance because it allows you to maintain the illusion that you're trying, while ensuring that you never actually succeed. Peterson talks about self-sabotage in the context of resentment and bitterness. He argues that when people feel like they've been unfairly treated by life, when they feel that the world has dealt them a bad hand, they often become bitter. This bitterness can manifest as self-sabotage. On some level, these individuals believe that they don't deserve success, or that success is unattainable for them, so they act in ways that ensure they stay stuck. One of the most profound ideas Peterson presents is that life is inherently full of suffering. There's no way around it. Everyone at some point will face hardship, failure, and pain. The question is not whether you will suffer, but how you will respond to that suffering. Will you allow it to make you bitter, or will you use it as fuel to propel you forward? Self-sabotage is often a response to the belief that life is unfair. When you feel like the odds are stacked against you, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, "Why bother trying if I'm just going to fail anyway?" This mindset is a form of defeatism, and it leads to behaviors that undermine your own potential. You might procrastinate, make careless mistakes, or engage in destructive habits that erode your chances of success. But here's where Peterson's wisdom comes in. He argues that the only way to transcend suffering is to take responsibility for it. This is one of the cornerstones of his philosophy. Peterson often talks about the importance of taking on the burden of being. Life is difficult, yes, but the meaning you derive from it comes from shouldering that burden and moving forward in spite of the challenges. In his book 12 Rules for Life, Peterson writes extensively about the necessity of taking responsibility for your own life, even when it feels unfair. He explains that you cannot control everything that happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. Self-sabotage, then, is a failure to take responsibility. It's a way of avoiding the discomfort of facing your own potential, because potential is frightening. If you acknowledge that you have the potential to succeed, you also have to acknowledge that you have the responsibility to make that success happen. This is where the concept of voluntary suffering comes in. Peterson argues that the most meaningful life is one where you voluntarily take on the challenges of existence. You choose to confront your fears, to take risks, and to bear the weight of responsibility, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary for growth. When you avoid risk, when you self-sabotage, you're essentially refusing to take on that burden. You're choosing comfort over meaning, and in the process, you're shrinking your potential. So, let's reflect for a moment. How often do you find yourself engaging in behaviors that undermine your own success? Do you procrastinate, make careless mistakes, or avoid opportunities because you're afraid of failing? These are all forms of self-sabotage, and they're rooted in fear. But it's not just fear of failure, it's fear of responsibility. It's fear of stepping into the unknown and confronting the fact that you are capable of more than you've allowed yourself to believe. Peterson's message is clear: the only way to overcome this fear is to take responsibility for your own life. You must confront the chaos, take risks, and accept that suffering is a part of the journey. But in doing so, you open yourself up to the possibility of growth, transformation, and meaning. Now that we've examined the 5 signs that fear is holding you back: hesitation, rationalization, procrastination, over-preparation, and self-sabotage, let's explore how these behaviors can be transformed. Jordan Peterson's work is not just about identifying the patterns that keep us stuck, but about offering practical advice for overcoming them. So how do we break free from the grip of fear and step into a life of courage, responsibility, and growth? First and foremost, Peterson emphasizes the importance of confrontation. You must confront the things that terrify you. This idea is rooted in one of Peterson's core psychological principles, exposure therapy. In his teachings, Peterson often refers to the psychological concept of facing the dragon, a metaphor for the fears and challenges we avoid. The dragon in mythology is the embodiment of chaos, danger, and the unknown. But as Peterson explains, it's also the guardian of treasure. The things that we fear the most often contain the seeds of our greatest growth. In clinical psychology, exposure therapy is a well-documented method for treating anxiety disorders. The basic premise is that by gradually exposing yourself to the things that scare you, your brain begins to realize that the threat is not as overwhelming as it initially appeared. Over time, the fear diminishes and your tolerance for discomfort increases. Peterson applies this idea to life as a whole, arguing that the more you confront your fears, whether it's the fear of failure, rejection, or uncertainty, the more you'll expand your capacity to face life's challenges. But here's the key: you don't need to confront everything all at once. In fact, that's a recipe for overwhelming yourself and retreating back into avoidance. Peterson talks about the importance of breaking down large, intimidating tasks into smaller, manageable steps. If a task seems too daunting, your brain will naturally resist it. However, if you break it down into smaller, less threatening pieces, you can begin to tackle it incrementally. This is how you build confidence and momentum. For example, let's say you're afraid of public speaking, a common fear. If you try to give a speech in front of 500 people right away, you'll likely experience intense anxiety and possibly even failure. But if you start by speaking in front of a few friends, then gradually increase the size of your audience, your brain will slowly adapt to the discomfort. Each step becomes a victory, and these small victories accumulate into a sense of competence. Peterson's advice here is clear: start small, but start. Don't wait until you feel ready, because readiness is an illusion. The only way to truly prepare for the challenges of life is to face them head-on, one step at a time. The more you do this, the less fear will control you. Another powerful tool Peterson advocates for is honesty, particularly honesty with yourself. This ties into the idea of rationalization, which we discussed earlier. When you rationalize your inaction, you're not being honest with yourself about the real reasons you're avoiding something. Peterson argues that self-deception is one of the most dangerous psychological traps we can fall into, because it prevents us from confronting the truth about our fears and limitations. In his book 12 Rules for Life, Peterson writes extensively about the importance of telling the truth, or at least not lying. This rule isn't just about being honest with others, it's about being brutally honest with yourself. When you lie to yourself about why you're not taking that next step, you're reinforcing patterns of avoidance. You're telling yourself a story that justifies your inaction rather than confronting the uncomfortable truth that you're afraid. Peterson suggests an exercise: take a moment to write down something in your life that you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a difficult conversation with a loved one, a career move you've been putting off, or a personal goal that you keep delaying. Now ask yourself, why am I avoiding this? Be brutally honest. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't rationalize. What are you really afraid of? Failure? Embarrassment? Rejection? Once you've identified the fear, the next step is to ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen if I take this risk? Often, when you confront the worst-case scenario, you realize that it's not as catastrophic as you imagined. And even if it is, Peterson argues, you still have the capacity to handle it. Brings us to one of Peterson's most profound ideas, the necessity of responsibility. Peterson frequently emphasizes that the path to meaning in life is through responsibility. When you take on responsibility, you're not just accepting the burdens of life, you're giving yourself a purpose. Responsibility provides structure, order, and a reason to confront the chaos of the world. Without responsibility, life can feel aimless and meaningless, which only amplifies fear. Peterson's advice is to start by taking responsibility for the things that are within your control. Stop blaming external factors, your upbringing, your environment, your circumstances, and start focusing on what you can change. It's easy to use external factors as excuses for why you're not taking risks, but as Peterson points out, this is a form of victimhood, and victimhood is a trap. While it may feel comforting in the short term to blame your situation on outside forces, it ultimately leaves you powerless. Taking responsibility means acknowledging that you have the power to influence your life, even if it's in small ways. It means accepting that while you can't control everything, you can control how you respond to challenges. This is where true growth happens. When you accept responsibility, you're no longer at the mercy of fear, you're in the driver's seat of your own life. Let's return to the idea of the hero's journey, which is central to Peterson's philosophy. In mythology, the hero is called to leave the comfort of their ordinary world and venture into the unknown. Along the way, they face trials, confront their deepest fears, and ultimately emerge transformed. But this transformation only happens because the hero takes responsibility for their journey. They don't wait for someone else to save them, they take the risks necessary to achieve their goals. Peterson argues that each of us is on our own hero's journey. The challenges we face, whether in our personal lives, careers, or relationships, are the dragons we must slay. And the treasure we seek, whether it's personal growth, success, or fulfillment, lies on the other side of that confrontation. But here's the crucial point: no one else can walk this path for you. You must be the hero of your own story. You must take responsibility for your own life. This is why Peterson emphasizes the importance of not aiming too low. If you set your sights too low, you're not challenging yourself. You're not stepping into the chaos that is necessary for growth. Instead, you're staying within the realm of safety, where there's no risk, but also no reward. Peterson encourages you to aim high, even if that means risking failure. The higher you aim, the more potential there is for growth, even if the path is fraught with difficulty. But aiming high doesn't mean being reckless. It means setting goals that stretch you, goals that are difficult but achievable with effort. And once you've set those goals, break them down into smaller, manageable steps. Take action every day, even if it's just a small step. This is how you build momentum, and momentum is what ultimately helps you overcome fear. Peterson's philosophy is not about eliminating fear, it's about learning to live with it. Fear is a natural part of life, especially when you're pursuing something meaningful. But fear doesn't have to control you. By confronting your fears, taking responsibility for your life, and aiming for something higher, you can transcend the limitations that fear imposes. To summarize, the way out of fear and into a life of meaningful risk-taking is through a series of deliberate actions. Confront the things you fear, even in small doses. Exposure is the key to diminishing fear. Be honest with yourself about why you're avoiding certain risks. Don't rationalize or deceive yourself. Take responsibility for your life. Stop blaming external factors and focus on what you can control. Aim high. Set goals that challenge you and break them down into manageable steps. Take action, even if it's uncomfortable. The more you act, the less fear will control you. In the end, the question is not whether you will face risk in life, the question is whether you will face it willingly, with courage and purpose. As Jordan Peterson teaches, the treasure lies in the unknown, but you must be willing to confront the dragon to claim it. So, the next time you find yourself hesitating, rationalizing, or procrastinating, remember the only way to grow is to take the risk. And who knows? The thing you fear the most might just be the gateway to the life you've always wanted. So, will you take the next step?